The empire did not collapse because it lacked strength. It collapsed because it never resolved what it was. Long before borders shifted or alliances failed, there was a quieter fracture, an uncertainty that sat beneath rituals, languages, and loyalties. Austria-Hungary did not fall suddenly. It lingered, functioning on the surface, while something essential remained unsettled. What broke it was not a single event, but an identity that was never solved. This episode examines that unresolved condition, not as a story of rulers or battles, but as a recurring pattern that appears when continuity outpaces coherence, a pattern where endurance becomes inertia, and multiplicity is carried without integration. The focus here is not power, but time, not decisions, but meaning. How a civilization can survive for centuries while quietly deferring a question it never learns how to ask clearly. Austria-Hungary was not a nation in the modern sense. It was a composite, a layered inheritance of peoples, traditions and memories bound together more by history than by shared belief. Its form was old even as the world around it accelerated. Continuity was its strength, but also its burden. What it preserved so carefully was never fully reconciled with what it had become. This inquiry centers on that tension, how an empire sustained itself by postponing resolution, how stability can mask uncertainty, and how the refusal to define identity can feel like tolerance until time demands clarity. For centuries, the structure endured by balancing difference rather than resolving it. Languages coexisted without converging. Customs overlapped without merging. Loyalty was diffuse, layered, situational. One could belong without fully identifying. In earlier eras, this ambiguity functioned as resilience. The world moved slowly enough for contradiction to remain manageable, but time began to compress. As ideas of nationhood sharpened elsewhere, identity became less inherited and more asserted. Belief shifted from continuity to alignment. People began asking not just where they lived, but who they were meant to be. Austria-Hungary did not reject these questions. It absorbed them. It allowed them to exist side by side, unanswered. This was not avoidance in the dramatic sense. It was restraint, a faith that endurance itself was proof of legitimacy. That repetition validated structure. That time would smooth over differences rather than sharpen them. Ancient wisdom often warns that unresolved questions do not disappear. They wait. They accumulate pressure quietly, becoming more consequential the longer they are deferred. What begins as flexibility can, over time, become vagueness. And vagueness, when conditions change, turns brittle. The empire's identity was never singular, but it was also never plural in a coherent way. It relied on inherited forms to substitute for shared meaning. Ritual replaced resolution. Continuity stood in for coherence. This worked as long as memory outweighed expectation. But memory is uneven. Different groups remembered different pasts, not in conflict at first, but in parallel. Each carried a story of origin, loss, or endurance that did not fully align with the others. These narratives did not initially compete. They simply coexisted, layered within the same space. Over time, the gap between them widened. Modern pressures did not introduce fragmentation. They exposed it. When communication accelerated and comparison became unavoidable, ambiguity lost its protective quality. People began to notice that what held them together did not tell them who they were together. The pattern here is not unique to Austria-Hungary. Civilizations often assume that longevity itself is a solution, that survival confirms meaning, that repetition equals resolution. But endurance can also delay reckoning. The longer a question remains unanswered, the more destabilizing its eventual return. Austria-Hungary persisted through habit, through inherited rhythms, through the assumption that what had worked would continue to work because it always had. This assumption is ancient. It appears whenever continuity is mistaken for clarity. As time tightened, Small differences became sharper, not because they were new, but because they were finally compared. Identity, once fluid, began to seek boundaries. People wanted language to match allegiance, culture to match belonging, belief to match structure. The empire could accommodate diversity, but it could not translate it into shared meaning. Ancient cycles describe this moment as a threshold, not collapse, but hesitation, a point where a system can no longer expand its ambiguity without losing coherence, where restraint becomes delay and delay becomes fracture. What makes this pattern unsettling is its subtlety. Nothing dramatic announces it. Institutions continue. Daily life proceeds. The surface appears stable, but underneath, belief has begun to outpace form. People start living in futures the structure cannot support. Austria-Hungary was rich in memory, but poor in narrative integration. It preserved the past without agreeing on what that past meant collectively. Each community could point backward, but not toward the same place. This is where repetition enters. Not repetition of events, but of conditions. A civilization carrying unresolved identity eventually encounters moments that demand decision. Not externally imposed, but internally unavoidable. The question returns, no longer theoretical. Who are we, together? The empire had no single answer. And perhaps that was its quiet failure, not that it chose incorrectly, but that it never chose at all. Ancient wisdom does not insist that unity requires sameness. It insists that ambiguity has limits, that cycles tolerate contradiction only up to a point, after which they force clarification. When clarification did not come, interpretation filled the gap. Each group supplied its own meaning. These meanings did not initially negate each other, but as pressure increased, they became mutually exclusive. The fracture was not caused by disagreement alone. It was caused by the absence of a shared frame in which disagreement could remain productive. Without that frame, difference turned inward. Belief lost its anchor. Here, the inquiry turns inward. How long can we live inside identities that function but do not resolve? At what point does flexibility stop being resilience and start becoming avoidance? And when we inherit a structure that has endured, do we mistake its survival for understanding? Ancient patterns suggest that collapse is rarely the first consequence of unresolved meaning. Confusion is a sense that things continue but no longer add up, that rituals remain, but their significance feels hollow, that repetition persists but belief weakens. Austria-Hungary did not break because it contained many identities. It broke because it never articulated how those identities related in time, whether they were converging, coexisting, or merely postponing separation. Civilizations often fear definition because it feels like exclusion, but the absence of definition can also exclude, quietly, unevenly, over time. When people cannot locate themselves within a shared story, they begin to supply their own endings. The empire's long endurance gave the illusion that the question could always be deferred, that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to avoid decision. This illusion is familiar. It appears wherever continuity is trusted more than clarity. In ancient thought, time is not neutral. It tests unresolved structures. It applies pressure not through force, but through accumulation. Small inconsistencies compound. Deferred questions return with greater weight. The identity of Austria-Hungary was never solved because solving it would have required choosing a future, not just preserving a past, and choosing a future risks loss. It risks admitting that endurance alone is not meaning. The pattern lingers beyond the empire itself. It asks whether any civilization can survive indefinitely on inherited ambiguity, whether time eventually demands articulation, whether the cost of postponement is always paid later with interest. The empire dissolved, but the question did not disappear with it. It moved elsewhere, into new forms, new structures, new inheritances. What remains unsettling is not that Austria-Hungary ended, but that it lasted as long as it did without resolving what it was becoming. That survival delayed understanding. That repetition replaced reflection. Perhaps the deeper lesson is not about collapse, but about the danger of assuming that functioning equals coherence, that endurance equals agreement. That time will reconcile what we refuse to examine. The identity was never solved, it was managed. And when time changed the conditions of management, the unresolved question returned, no longer quiet, no longer patient. History does not punish ambiguity, it reveals it, slowly, repeatedly, until meaning can no longer be postponed and the past asks the present what it intends to become. Subscribe to Timeless Questions for more thoughtful journeys into the ideas and forces that shape civilizations and continue to shape us.